Welcome to Class Matters, the podcast where we ask the question, what would our country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? Class Matters is a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. I'm Catherine Isaac, Executive Director. Mark Demenstein, President of the American Postal Workers Union, welcome back, President Demenstein, and Adolph Reed Jr. are here for a post-election episode of Class Matters. But Mark and Adolph are not here to Monday morning quarterback the 2024 campaigns. Although there is certain to be much more analysis and finger-pointing over the next few months of what went wrong, a more pressing question for those concerned about the future of unions and of the working class is, where do we go from here? Instead of simply turning our eyes to the next election, how should we think about the challenges that lie ahead for working people and for the labor movement? Let's get started with introductions. Mark Demenstein is a postal worker who has served as president of the American Postal Workers Union since 2013. The APWU represents more than 200,000 USPS employees and retirees, and nearly 2,000 private sector mail workers. Under Demenstein's leadership, the APWU has made significant gains in bargaining for better wages and working conditions, established a grand alliance to save our public postal service, strengthened the unity among the four postal unions, helped forge the campaign for postal banking, and led the successful fight against privatization scheme involving the office supply chain Staples. Demenstein led the union through the pandemic, including the contentious 2020 presidential election. We're also joined by Adolph Reed Jr., who has been involved in working class politics for more than half a century. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. He serves on the board of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute and is the author of several books, including The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, and his latest, No Politics But Class Politics with Walter Ben Michaels. His column, Class Notes, appears in The Nation magazine. Welcome, Mark and Adolph.
Thank you. Really great to be here.
Thanks.
We're glad to have you. So let's get started with you, Mark. Much of the commentary we hear about the election sees the results as a sign of a reactionary or bigoted electorate. But voters in Alaska and Missouri passed ballot measures to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Those voters also passed paid sick leave ballot measures, as did Nebraska. At the same time, voters in those so-called red states elected politicians who oppose these policies. What does this tell us about what voters are thinking? Mark, let's start with you.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I've been a big proponent on the AFL-CIO Council, which I sit on as the president of the American Postal Workers Union, that our electoral politics should be very focused on issue-based politics, referenda, ballot initiatives. And this isn't the first time we've seen this phenomenon where working people are uniting around the common interest of better wages, paid sick leave, women's reproductive freedoms, and the like. And at the same time are electing politicians who oppose every one of those things. So I think there's some valuable lessons there, that workers will unite around our common interest and promote and propel those interests forward. But when we get stuck in the Tweedledum, Tweedledee, lesser of two evils, I've always been a Democrat, I've always been a Republican, my grandparents were this or that, or I like this or that. And then we end up very easily losing our way. And we end up losing a lot of our unity around the things that affect us all. So I'm a big fan of uniting where we can, not being afraid of the differences, not being afraid of struggling issues out, not being afraid of opposing white supremacy and what it does and dividing up the working class, but at the same time, really uniting around a thing. And that's a working class experience that we then learn from. We can make gains when we focus on the issues that uplift the working class and our families and our communities. But we don't necessarily make those same gains when it's just about what individual to elect to what particular position. So I think going forward, that's a really important way to involve workers in the political process.
Thank you. Adolph, jump in.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's obvious evidence, and not just from this election, but from the last several elections in states that otherwise went red, ballot measures that focused specifically on policy items that would improve working people's lives, one in the same states at the same time. And I think one of the longer term lessons that speaks to, and it gets kind of frustrating that our side never seems really to pick up on this enough to act on it, but that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the program, is that there's a clear and direct explanation that goes back at least to the Clinton administration and to NAFTA, maybe longer, even back to Jimmy Carter, maybe longer than that, that when the two parties converge around a terrain of political debate on which both sides are committed to avoiding class and political economic interests and to talking about nothing but culture and the different ways that they want to talk about what they call culture, then it's what working people, I know I hear a lot of liberals complaining now that workers have been voting against their interests. It's not that. In fact, it's not that at all. And that's a pretty sleazy and condescending thing to think about working people too. But that people vote on the basis of the actual choices that are before them. And if, as Mark says, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, well, this actor and that actor, it becomes the actor that you like better, or the performance that you like better, or what makes you feel like the way you would at a wrestling match or something, right? But when there are clear issues that are on the table, then we win most of the time. So the question then that we should take out to our compatriots is, well, why don't we do more of that, right? And now, especially, right, given the magnitude of the stakes of this election, as we all start talking about what to do next and how to go forward, seems to me that the priority has to be to work and in whatever ways we can and for however long it takes to try to change the terms of political debate, change the terms on which political discussion is centered so that workers have voices and actual concerns, at least shaping the mix, if not overall determining it. And it seems to me as we go forward thinking about what to do or how we should move next, then trying to put together that kind of movement, trying to generate that kind of movement should be uppermost in our minds, and that should guide all of the tactics underneath it.
Thanks. So let's talk a bit about what we are about to confront. Mark, you wrote in a statement to APWU members after the election that the negative and deep ramifications for postal workers, the labor movement, and all workers, as indicated by Project 2025, the right-wing blueprint for a Trump administration, is just beginning. Can you talk about what that might look like for postal workers as well as for the rest of the working class?
Sure. And I don't think we can sugarcoat this. I think we have to tell it the way it is. So let's just look at the postal world. So in the first Trump administration, that was probably the first presidential administration, where in writing and concrete proposals with the Office of Management Budget, which is the White House, advocated for the complete breaking up and selling off of the public postal system and the public postal service to private entities for private profit. So there would go universal service to the people of the country, a very important small d democratic right, no matter who we are, where we live. That's a right we have. Once it's based on profit, if some private entity can't make a buck, then there's not going to be any mail services. So that's what we're facing as postal workers. And I just talked about the public. Think about it, what it would do to our union, postal workers themselves, the decent union jobs, the rights and the benefits, the financial security, and so on. So that's what's awaiting postal workers. We know the Heritage Foundation has the right-wing Heritage Foundation, which constructed Project 2025. They've had in their sights the privatization of the Postal Service ever since their inception, because you're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars that's in the public domain and belongs to the people rather than belongs to Wall Street. They want their greedy hands on that money. In terms of the movement in general, I always try to remind people, because history starts getting old, that when Hitler and the Nazi Party took power in Germany, which they did, by the way, completely, quotes, legally, very similar to the period we're in this country right now, that period between 1921 and 1933. Within a couple months, right after if I recall my history correctly, right after a huge May Day demonstration, and it was a very militant and pro-socialist working class at a time, Hitler came in and the Nazi Party came in and actually banned unions and took union activists like us into forced labor, prisons, concentration camps, execution, and so on. So when Project 2025 talks about limiting union rights and workers' rights, that's a huge problem. So for instance, there's no question they're coming after the public sector unions. There's no question they're coming after not just the public sector unions, but the whole way the public sector works. We used to have the spoil system. I studied that when I was in, we called it junior high school back then, right? Where it was just political patronage. Whoever gave money, whoever campaigned, whoever knew who got the jobs. And then when an administration changed, the whole thing would change. The civil service system was a response to that. It was chaotic for the system. They wanted some stability. But the civil service system also brought in some more fairness in hiring amongst the African Americans, women, people of color, people from different economic backgrounds. Trump's talking about Project 2025, and Trump are talking about basically doing away with much of the civil service system and making it political appointments, which means you have to kiss the ring and be loyal to one individual, one king, one Caesar, or whatever. So that's a danger to working people as well, because might be our clean water, right? Our food supply, some semblance here and there, at least, of some public health care. So many of the things where government touches people that people generally don't even think about. So when they talk about dismantling government as if a civil servant employee is an enemy of the rest of the working class, that also presents real dangers. There's things in 2025 about allowing children back into factory work. We've spent generations bringing children out of workplaces so they can be in school, so they can enjoy their friends and childhoods and their families, and they can learn and grow. This is just outrageous. And then you talk about all the divisions that are being promoted by the Trump world and what that means to the working class. Adolf, you may be able to help me out on which robber baron from the previous century, I think it was Jay Gould, that said I can hire one half the working class to kill the other half. Think about what's happening now. Are immigrants really the enemy of other workers, or the bosses that exploit us all and maybe force us to leave our homes and come to other lands for a better life because it's too destitute at home to even survive, or too violent at home to even survive? Workers are workers, and we have to unite around our common interest, however we got here. By the way, the Postal Service is, I think, the largest civilian employer of veterans. Project 2025 directly attacks the right of veterans to get health care for problems that were created in their time in the military. And of course, most veterans are working class people. So there's just tons and tons there. Look, they're not going to get everything they're advocating for, but they're gunning for it fast and furious. And if we're not vigilant in defense of our unions, in defense of working class rights, and so on, we're going to have a heavy price to pay. So our resistance is going to have to be determined and strong right from the beginning. And one of the fears I have, by the way, is that people are so discouraged in some cases and maybe intimidated that people will think we can hunker down, put our head in the sand, and somehow this storm will pass. And that, to me, is the worst thing we can do. We're going to have to be determined, we're going to have to be vigilant, and we're going to have to be unafraid.
Thank you. Well said. Adolf.
Well, yeah, I don't have much to add to that for sure. I mean, it's absolutely right. I would just add that in addition to Project 2025, Trump's also got this Agenda 47 that is a direct attack on higher education, as well as the nonprofit sector right across the board, that intends to impose the same kind of absolute control and criminalization, basically, of any sort of dissent.
Adolf, you wrote in a recent op-ed for Nonsite, highlighting the importance of organizing a real constituency for a different way of talking and thinking about and doing politics. And both you and Mark have expressed the need for independent politics outside of the two-party system and organizing working people beyond simply turning them out for elections. Can each of you talk about what you mean by a different way of doing politics and what you mean by independent politics?
So, yeah, I mean, that comparison is there. And when Mark was talking about the immigration issue, I was reminded that a buddy of mine who used to run the Worker Center down here said that, well, one of his lines was that, no, the immigrants aren't taking your jobs. What's happening is that your employers are trying to redefine the job that you currently have as a job that only somebody with no rights would be eligible for. And that's one of the ways we ought to encourage people to think about this. Right. And the Democrats have not been good on that either, obviously. But the only way we're going to do this is by, again, struggling among working people to demand changes in the terms of political debate. And we're not going to do that by continuing to see politics as a matter of sort of blindly following after a Democratic candidate, every 4 years. But we need to get outside and to do the kind of movement building. So here's a little story, right, about how the right got to be so powerful. A big part of it, of course, was that they had the power of the ruling class behind them, and that's nothing to sneeze at. And they were well funded, much better funded than we can ever hope to be. But if that were the determinant, then there'd never be any good things that would happen for us politically. But the key moment was after Barry Goldwater got swamped in the 1964 presidential election. But what the ultra-right did was they pulled back and they went underground, basically, and started to organize in what seemed like congenial upper status suburbs around the country, especially in Southern California, but other places too, where they sort of field tested issues and like issue bundles that would enable them, through adverting to something else, like, prayer in schools or whatever, or anti-abortionism or anti-integration, to fashion a coalition, but among groups that didn't necessarily agree about a whole lot and wouldn't necessarily have been committed to the brutal pro-ruling class economic agenda that the right was fundamentally committed to. But they managed to create a coalition, or like my comrades in the Workers' Party in Brazil used to put it, an alliance, such that where, say, Christian fundamentalists who don't care at all about inheritance tax would vote for a candidate who supports inheritance tax, because they understand that that candidate's victory is a precondition for them to get what they want, and vice versa, right? I mean, cokehead investment bankers or tech types like in Wall Street would vote anti-abortion, no matter how much they depended on abortions, well, in their own lives or drugs or whatever, just because they knew that the fundamentalist candidate whom they elected would take care of their interests. After 16 years of that organizing, Ronald Reagan was in the White House, but they understood movement building, ironically, in a way that our side just hasn't so far. And what I'm thinking that the most fundamental thing for us to do, because like we've all been saying, and we've all seen from the results of the comparison between the outcome of the ballot initiatives and the outcome of the candidate-centered elections, is that when we can get a working class perspective out before the people, we'll win. But we've got to be able to create the movement that'll help us do that. And we might not be able to get it done between now and 2028. I'm not naive about this, because this is like a monumental task. But my consolation is that the things I think we have to do now are the same things that will be necessary when coming out of the other end of a fascist regime. Well, I sort of started, so I'll just take a second to wrap it up. I mean, this is like a mantra for me now. I've been saying it so long. I'm probably been saying it more than half my life. But I think that the best way for us to look at the electoral realm is that it's the domain for consolidating institutionally victories that have been won basically in the plane of social movement organizing. And for most of my adult life now, something happened somewhere in the 80s. I'm not sure when, what it was, but somehow progressives came to think that it's all about getting somebody elected, and ideally a Democrat, no matter what Democrat. And through the experience that the three of us shared in the 90s, like we saw, people came down a lot of different ways on that question in the abstract, but we needed to understand that the point is to alter the terms of political debate. And I think we can do that now. I think especially considering the advance in neoliberalism, we've probably got to do it more outside the electoral realm than in, but struggle to change the issues that people talk about, for politics, and also change the way they talk about them. And one last thing I'm going to say about this is I've been struck at how many different stereotypical ways there are that people have of disparaging what they consider to be the working class. But the fact is, I go back to the ballot initiatives, but the fact is that the working people want basically the same stuff, and we'll make it clear.
So if I can jump in, Catherine. So independent politics, I guess, could have a few different, when people hear the term, they could think some different things. For us in the American Postal Workers Union, it's largely centered around the idea of being independent from the two dominant mainstream parties. They're both corporate parties. They generally will represent those interests first and foremost. It doesn't mean that there's never working class issues that get addressed, but they're not primary. And so independent politics is the idea of the labor movement and working people having their own agenda, their own demands, and not just when a Democratic Party leader says jump, the labor movement says how high. And that should be applied to all sorts of working class issues, whether it's living wages, whether it's trade, whether it's the right to organize, whether it's how to deal with the question of, and it's not an easy question, the question of immigration and its impact on the working class and how to unite and thrive rather than allow us to be separated and divided. But independent politics also, and Adolf touched on this just now, we touched on it earlier, it also includes the idea of the referenda initiatives so that we're dealing and organizing. Think about knocking on a neighbor's door. You could be talking about living wages, or you can talk about electing Mark Dimmonstein. Which is more important? And which builds that coalition, the alliances that we need to win? I took great note, as others did, on this Nebraska Senate race in this election. And I think that when you talk about independent politics, and by the way, our union is on record from a national convention, the highest authority in our union. We're about 2,000 delegates elected from their locals back home and their states back home coming together. We passed a resolution, I believe in 2016, may have been in 2018, advocating for independent politics. And some of it was around the referenda issue. Some of it was around the idea of building third parties, labor parties. But back to the Dan Osborne Senate race. So here's a Kellogg worker union leader who said, I'm going to run for Senate in a conservative state. And by the way, when we talk about unifying the working class, Adolf, I don't use red and blue. That's a product of the mass media and putting maps on the walls, and that divides working people. I don't buy this red, blue, purple, and all of that stuff. But Dan Osborne stepped up. Nobody thought he had a snowball's chance, and you know what. And he almost won. And he ran, leave aside the political positions. They might have been kind of all over the map. But the main thrust of his program is you don't have working class people like me in Congress. He actually said something like, Congress is mostly predominantly totally made up of millionaires doing the bidding of billionaires. And he came in a hair's breadth of winning this major upset and did very well. So I think there's a lesson in there about how the people reacted, given the chance for independent politics. And I think we need a lot more campaigns like that in the future. And while I'm strongly, and I know both of you are too, that's how we met in the effort to build a labor party in the U.S. That's not going to happen by magic, and it doesn't have to happen separate from races like the Dan Osborne race or separate from electing good people to Congress. We're for electing good people to Congress. We're for electing good mayors. We're for electing good city council, using the system that we have to move us forward without becoming that's our only path. And so there's a lot in the labor movement when I raise with other presidents and so on, the need for labor. Well, we don't have enough density. We don't have enough power. We'll never get there. They think it has to be one or the other. I don't think that's the right path. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think we can be deeply engaged in referenda politics, ballot initiatives, even getting behind good progressive candidates. We approach it in our union on a bipartisan basis. If we got a Republican that's done right by postal workers and working class people, we back them. But at the end of the day, we know that's not going to solve our problems. It may give us a better playing field. So we think independent politics is very important. And I think the Nebraska race is almost a referendum that people are so disgusted with the two-party system that they were wide open to a working class union leader becoming a senator from a conservative, largely rural state.
Thanks, Mark. I like what you said too about the difference between knocking on somebody's door to talk about an issue or to talk about a candidate, right? When we work on issues together, it builds unity, what the other side is trying so hard to tear down. And it gives people the experience of engaging in politics in a real way, right? So that we can build working class power to get what we need and what we want, regardless of who's in office. Tony Mazzocchi used to love to say, we got the Occupational Safety and Health Administration under the Nixon administration. And that's because there was a movement demanding it, right? Workers demanding it. So on the matter of organizing a united constituency, On our last episode, Mark Dudzik recalled the success that the Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, had in stoking anti-union sentiment among non-union working class by attacking public sector workers' benefits. As union membership continues to decline, it's out of reach for most workers. How does this inform what the labor movement's politics should look like?
That's a deep question.
It is.
Well, again, their game is divide and conquer. They meaning Wall Street, the corporations, the billionaire class. And anytime they can put a wedge in the working class, they're going to try. And there's no question that they constantly try to put a wedge between the public sector workers and the private sector workers. And it's the idea, if you're a private sector worker, look what your taxes are going for. They don't talk about the taxes that go into the military industrial complex and all these unjust wars, but somehow that public sector worker is stealing your tax dollars. So it is certainly a wedge issue. We are in a time where those tactics may not be as successful as maybe they were under Christie's period in New Jersey, because the sentiment amongst the working class, the pro-union sentiment amongst the working class, is amongst the highest it's ever been. So that wedge issue may not be quite as effective for them in, let's say, this election as it might have been in the past or might be in the future. But anytime we're so diminished as a movement where we're 6.5% of the private sector and about 10.5% of the entire working class, it enables the corporations to focus in on the minority in defense of the majority. So part of our job, I think, as a labor movement is number one, organize like organize like hell, and let's build the labor movement. But part of building that is for the demands of the labor movement to be demands for the entire working class. I've been fortunate to have a relationship with the Philippine labor movement, the Kilusung Mayo Huno, the militant wing. They demand increases to the minimum wage, let's say, is one of their main demands because they're fighting for all workers. And then workers see that the KMU and the union movement is fighting for them, whether they're in a union or can be in a union at the moment, or be, maybe they're unemployed in the moment. Maybe they're in a tiny place and they've got one person working there, two people working there. So I think that when the labor movement takes up the fight for healthcare as a human right, healthcare for all, living wages for all tied to future inflation, how to deal with questions of immigration in a pro-worker way, how to deal with these trade deals, the whole tax structure that so much favors the wealthy and the rich over the working class, how our tax dollars are used. Those are all working class issues that the labor movement should be leading the way for all workers. And when workers feel that and see that, they're not going to be as susceptible to the divisions that the corporate powers want to inflict on us.
So this is the last question. In the 1920s and the 1930s, a number of unions sponsored labor schools, including the Brookland Labor School and the Highlander Folk School. Workers had the opportunity to study political economy, history of the labor movement, and political action, among other things. These schools helped fuel the labor resurgence of the 1930s. The movement also had a vibrant labor press. Few unions today have extensive political education programs. Significant exceptions include the Communication Workers, the UE, and NUHW, and a few others. And the APWU has recently created a Leadership Institute. On the Class Matters podcast, we always ask some variation of what would the country look like if it were governed by and for the working class. It feels like we're a million miles away from that reality. So instead, I'd like to ask each of you how a program of political education could fit into the long game of building worker power.
Yeah, my take in general is that, we've lost a lot of the ways we had to communicate working class perspective and points of view, but within the class, basically, and to people, especially outside of unions, as the organized sector has increasingly diminished. So one of the things we have to do is, the labor press is gone, for instance, by and large. Labor radio stations have shriveled, and Mark probably knows this, but there was a time in the late 40s to the mid 50s, I think, when Walter Reuther was even trying to push to create a labor television network. But some combination of lack of imagination and a lack of access to enough resources killed that idea. Don't need to try to relitigate that. But I think what we have to do is find ways to go back to what we might think of as the old CIO approach, right, to organizing and maintaining a union, to do the kind of deep political education within unions and within the class more broadly, for which trade unions seems to me have to be the central vehicle that kind of helps to pull away the camouflage, right? To show the connections, right, between what cutting Medicare does to everybody, right, to all working people, or Social Security, or the public sector. The idea that we could have a country without a national postal service is just incredible to me. That means you don't have a country anymore. And as others have pointed out, that's the one office of the national government that's specified in the Constitution, right?
Well, I think that one of the lessons we can draw from this election and some previous ones is that the working class does not have a political home, and we're kind of lost in the wilderness. And that we, I've compared it to we're lost in the political desert. And you want to find that oasis because you need shelter, you need water, you need food. And so you're going to go wherever you can. You're hungry and thirsty. But that oasis, as we learned in science class a long time ago, is often a mirage. But one of the reasons we don't have a political home is we haven't done that kind of political education amongst the working class, let's say like the trade union educational leagues did in the 1920s and 30s. So I think we have an obligation within our unions and worker centers and in other forums to do more political education. We call it to make the connection between politics and economy. So many of the unions, including my own, have been very focused over decades on negotiating contracts, enforcing the contract, processing grievances. And we developed a whole system, in a sense, a system where that's what we've taught the workers. The union is some kind of insurance company, some kind of social worker entity, where if you got a problem, you go to an elected rep and say, take care of my problem, rather than building a union movement. So part of our reason for our new Leadership Institute at the APW, I don't know if your listeners know, Catherine, that you're helping us out with that, and we're really glad that you are, is to make that connection between politics, what's happening in Congress, what's happening in legislation, what happens in our election, how to deal with referenda politics, the whole question of independent politics that we're talking about. Where is it said in law that we can only have two parties and they both got to represent Wall Street? And what the rich tell the working class is leave politics to us. You just take care of your day-to-day, punch the clock, earn a living. Maybe you can file a grievance here and there. Maybe we can tolerate a union here and there if you don't get too militant. But basically, stay out of politics. That's the worst thing working people can do. And we're the vast majority. The vast majority should rule in our interest. And we got to find a way to get there. So the Leadership Institute is a tiny, tiny, tiny effort to try to at least develop in our own ranks a deeper political economic understanding of what it means to be a worker in this country. Who does the economy work for and why? What about our foreign policy? Who does that serve and why? What about our tax structure? Who does it serve? Why? Why is there a $7.25 an hour minimum wage at the federal level when the Democrats have had all three trifectas of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives? There has to be answer to that. And we want our coming activists, and we're really looking towards the future, to understand that building the union movement, building the labor movement, building the working class movement is not just about enforcing a contract and filing grievances. We leave our workplaces and we live in our communities, and we live in a country, and we live in a world. We can have the greatest contract there is, but if we don't have air to breathe and water to drink, it's not going to do us a whole lot of good on a dead planet, for example. Or if our sons and daughters are being asked to kill and be killed in the interest of the oil companies, fossil fuel, and Wall Street. So we try to make that connection and uplift people through education. And then a lot of our goal in the Institute is how to turn that education into action. Because if we're just talking about it, that doesn't mean that much. So we want to educate, we want to encourage, we want to inspire, we want people to learn from each other, and then go out and be in a better position to lead, not necessarily through an elected position, but to lead a stronger working class movement going forward. And certainly one of the lessons of this election is we need a stronger working class movement. We haven't talked about, Catherine, I don't know if there's a time, but one thing that really struck me in looking at the results of this election is 18 million less people voted in 2024 for president than in 2020. So here we had a hotly contested election. And I think that That reflects a few things. Some of it could be real disgust with this administration's approach to Gaza and people just stayed home. Certainly that affected some states. But I think fundamentally most of it is people are disgusted with the status quo, the business as usual, this two-party system. And I tie that back to the question of the need for more political economic education and how workers can understand that and then lead the way forward to a better life for all workers, not just here, but around the world.
Amen.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks. Adolf, you want to add to that?
No, that's a great point. But with the end on, I would just say that, I mean, just speaking for us as DJDI, if I may, I mean, that's certainly the view that we've come to and shared. And I'm convinced that's the only way for us to move forward. I would have one tiny addendum just to underscore the point that Mark made about the attacks on the public sector, that you both remember when Schwarzenegger was governor of California and he went after public pensions, it seemed for sure that we were going to lose. But the nurses and the firefighters took to the streets and they mobilized their members and protected their pensions as connected to the public services that they provide as a public good. And the Chicago Teachers Union, like in a strike in 2012, turned Mayor Rahm Emanuel over on his ass, basically. I hope I can say that, because they went to the public and defended public education as the public good and got overwhelming support. And that connects to the education piece too, because we can explain to people or help people understand why the public libraries are being cut in their cities, right? And where that money's going, but what the logic of capital is. What's driving the affordable housing crisis, right? I mean, how could we have done housing differently? How do people try to do it differently? What a role do the market forces and politics play in all this? And an armed and clear-headed working class movement is ultimately going to be the thing we need more than anything else.
Thanks. And, that's the other two examples are the postal workers engaging the public in the battle against outsourcing to Staples, as well as protecting vote by mail in the 2020 election and subsequent elections. And I think that's I'm going to even call it a hopeful way to end the conversation. Rather than cheerleading for candidates, people need to be talking about historical examples like these not so long ago, not in the dustbin of history, but in our lifetimes, wins that working people have made when we unite and when we engage the public. So thank you, Mark and Adolf. You've been listening to Class Matters, episode 16 with Mark Dimmenstein and Adolf Reed Jr. Our podcast engineer is Jimmy Wirt. You can subscribe to Class Matters wherever you listen to podcasts, and thank you for listening.